Thank you. What a talk to follow. You know, what do you sort of talk about after that? I'm going to talk about how I don't like Top Gun Maverick for 20 minutes, and you all have to listen. So yeah, hello. Thank you, Sarah, for the introduction. My name is Jess, and this is my talk. Infra Engineer to Staff SRE. So I'm an SRE at Apptio. I work as part of the Platform and Reliability Engineering team, PRE. Probably like many people here, my job involves helping internal teams develop apps that are secure, reliable, and cost-effective. I'm not defined by my job, so just a bit of a cliche. I also enjoy riding bikes and coffee, like probably heaps of us. I'm a little bit nervous because somewhat awkwardly, the talk is very different to anything I've given before. I'm going to talk a little bit about my own story, which is kind of hard to do. But I'm really hopeful that it's going to open up thoughts within others on how you approach your work and possibly broaden your horizons a bit on how you approach your career progression. So my intent is really to demonstrate that there's not one golden path to be followed to reach the title of an SRE, and it can encompass many different skill sets. And I also want to communicate that developing to the staff level, it doesn't come by just a pure technical focus. There's other means. I shouldn't touch the laptop, but there we go. So any great talk starts with a slide labeled caveats. You know, up front, it's a soft skill talk, so I submitted 3 talks to SREcon. The other 2 were technical, and this was the third. And it turns out this one was chosen, and I haven't done a soft skills talk before. My God, it's harder. I can't just stand up and present about metrics or an implementation plan and sort of talk about outcomes. There's a lot more nuance. So thank you to the committee for choosing this talk. There are no hot takes in this talk. I don't think I present anything mind-blowing or that you'll sort of do that emoji kind of thing. I'm simply just trying to highlight different approaches we can take. You know, what even is a staff engineer or an SRE? I think that's a really big thing that a lot of us are dealing with right now. If I asked everyone in this room to define an SRE or what a staff level is, we'd probably have different definitions. And then even if we define it differently, the organizations that we work for define it differently as well. So an SRE at, you know, company A will be different to company B. I think it's really key to understand how you personally define SRE, and then also how the org you work for defines SRE. And that similarly is with that sort of staff title as well. Since I submitted this talk, a book was released called The Staff Engineer's Path. It's a fantastic book by Tanya Riley. I've almost finished it. It's colored this talk a little bit, but I really don't try and tread the same ground. So it's worth reading. Just super quick, so the staff title is sort of like, you know, I think in Australia we had principal engineers were a bit common, but staff is sort of really kicked off in the US and now is becoming much more global. It's like this individual contributors sort of path that you can go from senior where you can keep developing instead of just becoming a manager. Who am I? I think what I wanted to demonstrate here is talk about sort of the first job I had, my introduction to the industry. So I was a support engineer at a company based in Rosebery in Sydney called Bulletproof Networks, and my very first team lead is actually here today, which is great, and another colleague as well. And you know, sort of if I think back to those days, we considered ourselves to be bleeding edge, but realistically, you know, I did an 8-week unpaid internship at the company before I was offered a job, and you know, I was SNMP walking managed Cisco devices to configure NetSync checks to monitor disk space. Like I was the MIB king kind of thing. That's sort of to give you an idea. You know, I think one of the other early things, I had to like copy documentation from one management sort of repository into Twiki, which was a huge thing at the time. But it was a really great introduction to the industry, you know, and we all sort of start somewhere, and I think you have to acknowledge where you've come from and where you started to where you're at now. Now I am a staff SRE with Apptio. You know, I've worked 7 years remote now. When I joined, we were with private DCs running our own sort of bare metal virtualization, and now we're cloud-based. I wrote this down before seeing that previous Kubernetes talk, but we run 38 clusters, and then seeing like 1% of traffic is 1,000 nodes, and it's like, okay, I'm not going to talk about our clusters because they're just a lot smaller. You know, my initial exposure to SRE, so how does this journey begin? I think this is probably something a lot of us have gone through. So through my career, I've had the luck of working with talented and smart people, and with each person you meet in your job, they push you further and they challenge your current way of thinking. And this was probably about 6 years ago, so just after I joined Apptio. You know, we had some challenges, and I remember one of my colleagues, Colin, who I still work with today actually, he was voicing sort of these frustrations that we're the platform team, but it's very much this sort of black box monitoring, like we're on one side of the fence trying to peer in and instrument applications from the outside. There wasn't sort of any of this idea of observability and that sort of stuff. It was very much a sort of, you know, a team builds it, the classic, they throw it over to us to run it. And so there was no feedback loop on the pain points. It was difficult. And so I think that was sort of this inkling of like, you know, well, okay, maybe we're not doing things as best as we could. And I can't remember exactly how I was introduced to the book, which I think every SREcon has to have a screenshot, I guess, of that. But I somehow got onto the book, and I remember just thinking, yeah, I'm going to be that guy, I'm going to read the book. And it was so overwhelming. Like, I don't know if anyone else had this experience, but I would come into this book and it was like, oh, error budgets, golden signals, toil, embedded SREs. You know, I'm working in the industry and I thought I was in this highly performing team. I was in a highly performing team, but I just hadn't had any exposure to any of these approaches. And that was quite confronting. You know, I couldn't correlate this book with how I was achieving my job. And that sort of was a bit of a shifting moment for me. It solidified what hadn't really felt right, and it sort of drove this desire that I wanted to change a bit how I was doing things. And so I sort of started this journey to become an SRE. So I think it all started with seeing the problems with the current approach, the way we were doing things, and the SRE framework, I guess I'll loosely use the term, it appealed to me. Not so much as solutions, like you're not going to just copy-paste what Google was doing. I'm sure many companies have tried. But just, you can take that in and process it and use it to alter your approaches to work. You know, try and learn from how other teams, or at this point Google, were doing this SRE approach and apply where we could see value. For me personally, I sort of set this challenge of like, not so much that I want to be an SRE, but that was sort of where I wanted to head with my career. It was super early days. You know, you think back to when the SRE book came out. I think DevOps jobs was sort of the hot. Everyone wanted to be a DevOps engineer. The SRE stuff hadn't kicked off, but I felt this is where I wanted to go. I didn't write this down at the time, but how did I want to change? You know, I wanted to sort of move towards data-driven thinking. Really understanding observability, because up to that point, I don't think I'd really understood the importance of that sort of thing. Operating at scale, and sort of understanding golden signals and that sort of stuff. As a big part of that was also trying to identify tool sets that aligned with SRE and sort of start learning that. So kind of moving away from like, you know, your Puppet config management stuff into, you know, some of the newer, bigger stuff. Personally changing my programming skills a little bit. So up to that date, I think I was primarily like Ruby sort of based, and then starting to pick up sort of Golang. And of course, as any good SRE, I have to run Kubernetes in production. So yeah, it sort of kicked off this change in my mindset. And it allowed me to change the way that I approached technical solutions. And so it was about applying what I was learning as I was going on, and then also attempting to take that and drive change within the organization as well. So in some cases, it wasn't just me that had to change. It was, you know, your organization might not be exposed to the SRE sort of way of doing things. So it's bringing the company along for the journey as well. Two of the biggest points that I wanted to call out that sort of fit into that journey really well. Considering the larger picture, you know, how does a solution or approach grow into the future? And, you know, there's always going to be concessions when you look at something and you'll be like, well, this isn't going to scale, or it's not going to work. You might have to make compromises and concessions, but I think it's really valuable that you can see those ahead of time and know about them. They don't necessarily have to be blockers, but you can squirrel it away and say like, okay, well, when we get to this point, we have to touch on them. And then thinking at scale, which really for me was like, what business processes work today that we're doing, but what are they going to look like into the future, where if we want to grow 1,000 times or 10,000 times, you know, how can we deal with that sort of stuff? Yeah, so sort of mapping out the journey, these were three little highlighty things that I wanted to have. You know, more than one approach. So I sum this up with saying there's no golden path for so many things in life. You know, we each are finding our own way. There's no golden path to become an SRE. There's no golden path to become a staff or a principal engineer. You know, different approaches to achieve each. And sometimes part of that journey can be recognizing that the approach that you're currently taking or that you've started isn't the right one, and that you may need to reevaluate. You may need to reevaluate that approach and change tact a little, which I think can be really hard to do. It's not failing, because I don't think anyone ever really truly fails. It's just, you know, acknowledging that something needs to change and being that change within yourself. If I can figure out how to scroll, I've lost my mouse. The other thing I wanted to talk about as well, especially on the more than one approach, is this touching on the technical approach. Like, we live in this engineering world, so when people think about attaining another, like a promotion or something, it generally is thinking that as my technical knowledge grows, my job title will change. As I get a deeper knowledge of a system, I can get a promotion. Sort of an alternative path that I think I've gone down, and probably other people have as well, is it's more about understanding your surroundings, collaborating with others, and using your experience and skill sets to increase velocity of the delivery of projects. So not necessarily becoming technically more sound, but understanding how the organization operates and being able to increase velocity. So for me, that was really important. You know, it was a key sort of skill that I had to bridge multiple teams to be able to shorten these blocking projects that we had. And as you do that, you build more relationships as you go. So it's sort of like this self-fulfilling kind of thing. Wow, 20 minutes goes super fast when you're up here. You know, one of the other things I sort of wanted to call out as well was like this concept of, we've probably all heard of the 10x engineer or the 10 times developer or that sort of thing. You know, what is that? Is that someone that can write code 10 times faster than you, or for one feature that you ship, they can ship 10 features? So I think that has already been debunked a little bit, but I actually do believe in sort of the 10 times engineer, but I bring my own little skew to it. For me, a 10 times engineer is a multiplier. So if you're one engineer, and in my mind, if you bring 10 people along with you on your journey, you're a 10x engineer. So, you know, as I gain knowledge and improve, I'm educating peers around me. You know, I'm writing good documentation, I'm doing demos, and I'm bringing them along with me. That for me is a 10x engineer. And to really stretch the connection to bikes, which I love, which I have to have in here, is like I'd compare it to like a peloton in the Tour de France, right? If you have one person break away and they go hard, there's a chance that they could win the stage, right? But they're putting in so much more effort. They're taking all of the wind and they're going alone. There's a real high chance that they're going to burn out. You look at the pack, a bunch of cyclists, they're all together. They're sharing the load. They're rotating. 9 times out of 10, they're going to catch that person that's gone it alone. So I think that's something I always think about is like working together, bring people with you. Even, and you don't have to be a staff engineer or a principal to do that. You can do that from day one. Really important. Empathy. Oh, I could talk about empathy for 20 minutes alone. I think it's a huge skill set that we need more of and that people have to have. It's the easiest way to build relationships. Take the time to understand the problems of others within your organization, feel their pain points, and work towards a common goal. Don't sort of put those blinkers on of these are my deliverables and what you need to do, not my problem. That's not going to help anyone. I have to talk about this. Imposter syndrome. I would hazard everyone in this room is familiar with the term imposter syndrome. I'd written down a joke from Among Us, but I'm not going to do that to resonate with the cool kids. But if we reduce imposter syndrome, what is it? It's basically, it's feeling like you don't belong, right? That you're not as competent as others, or that you're a fraud. I think everyone's familiar with it. Literally, I'm standing here right now and struggling with imposter syndrome. So it's super common. And moving into the SRE world, it amplified that like 5 times for me. Suddenly I'm reading about embedded SREs working with SLOs, SLIs, SLAs, every SL under the sun, evaluating metrics to determine latency improvements. What am I doing? Like, I don't belong here. For me, my approach was to understand, like, I was reskilling effectively is what was happening. And that, I could apply my experience and build from there. So that was something that probably a lot of people have been through. I also remember having to deal with this like cognitive dissonance of like, I was given the job title of an SRE, people would refer to me as an SRE, but in my mind, an SRE was sort of this high bar that the Google book had set for me. And so I wasn't performing all the things that the Google book laid out, so I'm not an SRE. I don't and it's sort of dealing with that. And I love this saying, perfect is the enemy of good. And I think we can apply it in so many facets, like, I may not be that perfect SRE, but it doesn't mean I shouldn't try, and you can try and contribute. Overcoming the doubt. So how to deal with imposter syndrome. It's hard. So one of the strategies I was going to call out that I did for me, we launched into the Kubernetes world, and suddenly I'm advising teams on how to do Kubernetes deployments, how to consume a platform that we've built, and all this sort of stuff. And that was really hard to, who am I? Why should I tell you how to do it? I went out and sat the CCAD. I don't know if many people heard of the CCAD and the CKA, Certified Kubernetes Application Developer. I'm getting a nod, perfect. And it basically, all it was, I'm not a huge fan of certifications, but it was just a way for me to sort of benchmark, like, yes, I can do this, I passed the exam, I'm worthy to be here at the table and talking. Highlighting career wins, really important. I think I'm getting close there, I don't know. Well, I'm glad I'm keeping time because no one else is. We'll just roll through. We'll do live negotiating? Yeah, okay, great. Head above water. So I talked about in the blurb this idea of the ever-evolving industry that we work in, right? Things are changing like every week. It's madness. What's that classic thing, the CNCF landscape? The poster with all the tiles, like what is happening? How can we expect one person to truly have a deep knowledge of those tiles? That's just one example, right? There's so many other things. I don't have all the answers, but I can only tell you how I've dealt with them, and you can try and take some thought from that. So the tailor inputs to your level. I think it's really important for each of us to select what works for us. So you can't just take what works for someone else and apply it to yourself. It might not work. So, you know, you would subscribe to a subset of newsletters. That might be your sort of thing, a weekly periodical. There's heaps out there, like the SRE Weekly, DevOps Tools, Platform Engineering Weekly, that sort of stuff. Join some high-value Slack channels. Might be work for some people. But it's just important that you understand that you need to choose your input and upkeep and what works best for you and sort of tackle that approach. I would also say don't be afraid to change, be dynamic, right? If you are struggling, if there's too much information or you're overwhelmed, you can trim it down. That's perfectly fine. Another thing that's really worked well for me is connecting with others in a format that is suited. So like local meetups are a really big thing. And then a few Slack with niche focus is quite handy. Industry events like SREcon, this is great to come out and meet people and that sort of stuff. Don't fear the unknown. So don't be afraid to say, I don't know. I think that's something a lot of people can sometimes struggle with, especially if you're on the Zoom call with other teams. You sort of almost have to front and be like, yeah, I know the platform and that sort of stuff. But I think if we don't fear saying, I don't know, we create a sort of safer space, not just for ourselves, but for everyone else. And I think Nora and Laura touched on that. The psychological safety can be really important within an organization. Keep journeying. I think it's a word, but I'm not sure. But I think it's important to stress, like, all of us are on this adventure of our careers, and I don't know if it ever really stops. 2 minutes. You know, and so you can keep making improvements. So be your own ally. At the end of the day, you have to look after number one, you know, focus on yourself. Identify your personal goals and work towards achieving them. So use personal goals, and they don't have to be work-related. You know, they could be like, I want to work remotely 2 days a week. You know, it doesn't have to be, I want to be a senior developer or whatever's next. Invest in yourself and career, but I really want to caveat that with saying, you know, you can do that without needing to burn hours outside work. I think that work-life balance is super important, and we sometimes lose touch with that. The last one, set a career path goal and go after it, or don't. Like, you know, so many people, I think, get caught up in climbing this and climbing, and when do you stop climbing? Like, when do you actually just be like, okay, cool, I'm happy here for a bit, like I can do this for a couple of years. And then this is the big finish, the key takeaways. I think, hopefully, I've covered most of this, but it boils down to these 5 points. I think there are multiple ways to approach SRE, and I think probably a lot of people realize we all do it a little bit differently. And in that, there are different ways to approach career progression. And you don't have to tie yourself to a specific path. You can explore different paths and forge your own way. You know, we control our own destinies, so shape your own direction. Be in charge of where you want to go. You can make a decision and aim towards it. Communicate, support, and engage. So that's the empathy, which I just really big fan of. Build relationships, understand your workplace dynamics, and you'll find that a lot of other stuff just flows naturally around that. Embrace imposter syndrome, overcome it, prove your worth to yourself, and you'll find that you prove it to others in that way, and find those personal strategies that work for you. And you don't need to consume and know everything. I think this is a huge one. You know, you don't need to read every tweet. You don't need to look at every link on Hacker News every day. You don't have to be on every Slack. You can if you want to. Like, there are people that are in that world. But for me personally, my sort of motto is, you know, we work to live, not live to work. So it's sort of, my job is just to augment the amount of cafes I can ride my bike to, or that sort of stuff, you know? It's like one or the other. And that's me. Sarah didn't cut me off, so I'll just keep talking. Thank you, everyone.